Hello, everyone, and welcome to Words and Music 2021. We are so excited for the next few days, which will be filled with literature and history and arts and more. And we are very excited that we are able to bring you this festival mostly for free, live streaming on Facebook and YouTube, thanks to the generosity of many people who you'll be hearing about over the next few days. One of those organizations that has been incredibly generous with us this year is the Louisiana Division of the Arts. So, Words and Music, this event, and many others are supported by a grant from the Louisiana Division of the Arts, Office of Cultural Development, Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, in cooperation with the Louisiana State's Arts Council, as administered by the Arts Council of New Orleans. Funding has also been provided by the National Endowment for the Arts. So thank you for your support. Now, while these events are free, we are not going to turn away donations. Never will we do that because we are a nonprofit. The proceeds from Words and Music will go to support One Book, One New Orleans, which is hosting the festival this year and has for the last 4 years. So for you newcomers, I'll do our quick spiel. One Book, One New Orleans chooses one book each year, and we encourage everyone in the city to read that book and come together in conversation around it. However, we have to realize that our functional illiteracy rate among adults is much higher than the national average. So if we're going to be One Book, One New Orleans, we have to make that book accessible to as many people as possible. We develop a curriculum around the book, and we get that book and its curriculum free of charge into adult education programs, including adult ESL programs, programs for adults preparing for the high set, programs for low literacy adults, also programs for adults and juveniles who are currently incarcerated. We get the book into the ears of the blind and print handicapped through a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio. And last but not least, because we know that some folks are avid readers but cannot afford books, we make sure that every branch of the New Orleans Public Library has a few copies. So that's the name of the game, access and bringing everyone together. During non-pandemic times, we have a series of free family-friendly events centered on the book. And we never go to the same neighborhood twice in a calendar year. So if your barrier is transportation, one book will come to you. However, since the pandemic began, we have been hosting all of these events online. They're available on our YouTube channel. So you can actually go to the channel and you can watch every event we've had since 2020 and enjoy it at your leisure. The book for this year was The Yellow House by Sarah M. Broom. And it has inspired so many conversations about the deep meaning of home, about displacement, and about New Orleans East, which, as Broom points out, does not get a lot of recognition in the story of New Orleans itself. So when we thought about how to kick off the first full day of Words and Music 2021, we could think of no better event than to put Sarah Broom in conversation with another writer from New Orleans East who is absolutely blowing up the literary scene right now. And that's Maurice Carlos Ruffin. He'll be talking about his book, The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You Today, which is his most recent collection of short stories. Now, the conversation between Broom and Ruffin was recorded ahead of time. And after we watch that conversation, Maurice will come on for a live reading, followed by Q&A. So you can drop your questions and comments in the chat as you go along, and we will then come up at the end and Maurice will answer those questions. So feel free to give us a shout out, interact with us in the chat, and we'll be sure that those comments are seen and acknowledged. So without further ado, let's take it away, Maurice and Sarah.
All right.
Maurice, I am so happy to see you. I feel like this is so long overdue.
It's me again. The beauty of technical difficulties and going live and in person. All right, so in the meantime, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about some of the other things you can look forward to. Coming up later today, we have our keynote event, which is a conversation between Clint Smith and David Robinson Morris. Clint Smith is very close to our hearts. He was the One Book, One New Orleans selection in 2017 with his book, Counting Descent, which was a book of poetry. I had no idea he was a historian who wrote nonfiction as well. Turns out he does. And that book, How the Word is Passed, is a New York Times bestseller. We're going to look forward to hearing that tonight. We think the technical difficulties are fixed. We will try this again. And if not, I will come back and tell you what you can look forward to yet again. All right, take it away, Maurice and Sarah.
All right.
Maurice, I am so happy to see you. I feel like this is so long overdue. I can't believe all this time I've never been able to ask you my questions about your stunning work. And so this book in particular, which I have all marked up and have thought about and dreamt about, is such a great, it's an honor for me to be able to talk to you about these stories. And I think you know that these stories have never existed before now. So I'm very thankful for you to have written them. The characterizations of these particular New Orleanians haven't existed before this moment. And so I'm very proud of you for that. And I guess it makes me think about a few things having to do with place and with geography. But I guess the first thing I want to talk about with you is how did you create this specific cast of characters? How did you decide on these particular 19 stories? Because I know you a little bit, and so I know you produce voluminous amounts of work. So how did you come to decide that these were the set of characters you wanted us to kind of see in this way?
That's a wonderful question. And first of all, thank you, sis, for being here. On this idea of us being in conversation, maybe it hasn't been public. We've been in conversation this whole time, since day one. So this is just the public version of that discussion we've been having. The thing about it, I think that when I started writing this book, with the very first story that dates back 8, 9, 10 years, the very first question I asked myself was, whose voice had I not seen? And that character is Baby in the story, The Pie Man. And I just kept thinking about how, throughout my life, I had read so many amazing stories about young people, whether it was Ernest Gaines or Alice Walker or various things, and kind of thinking, I love those stories so much. And I hadn't seen New Orleans version of those characters. And maybe that was on me, maybe it was on somebody else. But I kept thinking, all right, my first story can't be about like a 30-something-year-old, lawyer in downtown New Orleans. I want to give one of these kids some shine. And so one way or another throughout the entire building of these stories, that was my thought process. When I had the majority of the stories already done, I kept asking that question, who have I not seen yet? But that's the reason why the stories Rhinoceros, for example, and the story Before I Let Go, Rhinoceros has, a trans girl or a trans woman, she's 18 years old, and a non-binary person. And then Before I Let Go has, a middle-aged lesbian woman. I'm kind of like, that's my auntie, that's my cousins. I've never seen them in fiction. So I kept saying to myself, all right, who are they? What do they sound like? What are their concerns? And how to do it in a way that is both like honest, entertaining, as well as respectful to their experience. Because again, I hadn't seen it before. And the whole thing was to not center myself at the center of the community, because the community is the character. And to be specific, the community is Black New Orleans.
Right. And so what, just sort of running with that, what did you find that there was anything particularly difficult about trying to write short stories about people you quote know? What did you have to think about in terms of the writing process specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that's a interesting question. And, I teach creative writing at LSU as well as many other places. And, one of the questions that newish writers will always ask, they'll get comments back from their fellow writers in the class about not having enough conflict, not having enough of protagonists with sort of verve in their heart. And the thing is, New Orleans people always have that verve in their heart. But then there's just questions of representation. What kinds of problems do you present in the story? I didn't want to be this thing where it's like, oh, the characters are all poor, or the characters are all struggling. But at the same time, and I remember I heard, in fact, it was Kessie that said this a few days ago. He said somebody asked him about this idea of presenting fiction that might be described as Afro-pessimistic. And he said, well, if you're Black in America, you're having a lot of these experiences. So you're going to present these experiences. And the way I think about it is that, for many of the characters, they are struggling. But at the same time, in New Orleans, struggle represents itself differently. We are the people who will have a second line, a few months after a hurricane. We're the ones who will have these amazing get-togethers that are designed to celebrate everything about life. We don't necessarily cry in the same way when a loved one dies. There's a celebration when it comes to that. So it was really a matter of thinking about each individual character, whether they were, in their 40s or 50s, or whether they're as young as, 10 or 11 years old, and kind of thinking, all right, what is a dramatic presentation, a concept, a setting that will show you the best and the most difficult parts of their character and their lives, and then going from there.
I mean, that's so intriguing to me because you come from having written We Cast a Shadow, right? Which I would describe as a kind of historical sci-fi surrealism, right? And then, do you think that's right about
That's on
right?
point.
Or
That's on point, sis. You got it.
okay. So then we get this collection of stories, which sort of in a way plays with magic, the idea of magic, and I think in certain ways is super grounded. The story that felt most levitating to me, right? Where you sort of where I have the sense of magic, and I think this is about control, is in the story, my favorite, I think, Fast Hands, Fast Feet. Because that's the story where you talk about flying. Flying is the best feeling they is, you write. And so, what was for you was that something you thought consciously about? I think you did, because that's what writers do. But why did you make that choice to ground these stories so firmly?
Yeah, I think that when people think about New Orleans and talk about New Orleans, there's all these illusions. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's white, and he said, what's funny, if I didn't know New Orleans as well as I did know New Orleans, I would think it was a white majority city. And he's like, he could see in the presentations of culture, commercials and even TV shows, there's this projection that's not realistic. And people who, are in a hotel room in California and they see a commercial on one of the hotel stations about coming to New Orleans, and it's like just, a bunch of like white folks in a resort type area, this one brother in the background playing the trumpet. It's like, that's not really us at all. So I kept thinking to myself, what's the opposite of that? The opposite of that is to have these characters who, even if they are working in hospitality or they're involved in music or these sort of almost cliche things, their lives are not about those things at all. It's about themselves, their loved ones, their hopes and their dreams, and about standing up to those expectations. In the novella, the novelette, the last piece in there, before I let go, Galia is somebody who is very much working in those different industries, hotels, restaurants, music, yada, yada, yada. And then in Fast Hands, Fast Feet, and thank you for that compliment. She's one of my favorite characters in that she has checked out of that entire universe. She has no plans whatsoever of being involved in any of that foolishness. She just wants to be free and wants to fly. And I think of all the characters in the book, she represents that free New Orleans spirit of, you know what? I just like want to just sit on a porch and just be myself for a minute. Forget about all that noise. And it's why I love her so much as a character.
I love her so much. And one of the things that struck me was there is a kind of running sensuality in the stories, but there's also almost a complete revulsion at times that has to do with touch, right? I mean, there's so many lines. You spin away before she wrap you tight and catch what you can, right? I don't like fingers touching on me, and fast hands, fast feet. Right? There's all of these moments where the characters are placing themselves outside of a kind of human touch and human connection.
Mm.
How does that figure in your own thinking about your work and about what, as a collective whole, it's attempting to do?
You're really going deep. I mean, these are questions that I think I subconsciously thought about when I was writing it, but I'm not sure I have a conception of what it really means. I feel like when it comes to touch, there's so many of these characters who are just aching to be seen, aching to be heard, aching to touch, aching to feel. They just want to, feel love, for lack of a better way of saying it. And, particularly with the girl with Fast Hands, Fast Feet, she's had the worst part of that. She's somebody who tried to find safety and shelter in a city that said, hey, we're going to take care of you. Come over to this mission and you'll be fine. And as she relates, she was not fine in that place. She was assaulted in that place. And so I think there's something about New Orleans that said that. It's almost like, in a majority Black city in which poverty is above the national average, in which illiteracy is way too high, in which gentrification is a very real thing. Even before Katrina, in some sense, people are trying to find that safe place. And it's out of reach to some extent for some people. And that's the reason why I think the community is so dead set on, again, maintaining second lines or maintaining these, going to somebody's house in the sun, eat some red beans, just the things that you can't get outside of the house or outside of the community. You're always fighting to have those things preserved within the community. So, touch is a dangerous thing. Touch is that thing that it's different than sight or hearing or even taste. It's one of the most intimate of interactions a person can have. It's the way of saying that you're not alone. And so for anybody to touch in any of these stories is a big deal. And I want to make sure that the stories reflect that as much as possible.
The stories, what's so interesting is that, and We Cast a Shadow, right? It's this kind of, geographically, we don't know exactly where it is. And then this book arrives and we know precisely where it is, right? It's so overtly New Orleans. Do you think there's such a thing as a New Orleans character? And if so, what is a New Orleans character? And then also, what's been the response, or what has been your perception of the response, having written a book that's so specifically New Orleans, as opposed to the more sort of nebulous feeling of and elsewhere in the first book?
Well, I have to say, this is one more example of how we're in conversation. I don't think I would have decided to make this a New Orleans book without the Yellow House. I've told you many times before, first thing I thought when I read Yellow House was, oh my goodness, she did the impossible. I feel like there's something about our hometown that's ineffable. It's just hard to put your finger on. And so if We Cast a Shadow, I was trying to acknowledge that. I'm not even gonna say this is New Orleans, maybe it is, maybe it's not, maybe it's also reality, yada, yada, yada. I read Yellow House, I'm like, it's like a mist, it's like a fog. There's so many things contained in the space, from the sort of historical representations of like the two guys from Texas come over to try and build this area in the East, the way your family exists in there, to your sort of mental travels and musings. And I kept thinking, okay, all right, this is like Sarah launched a comet, a meteorite down to the planet Earth, and just blew up and illuminated everything about New Orleans. All right, which area can I go into? Well, I'm gonna take some specific characters and allow them to present themselves on the stage of the book. I think that the book has been as well received as We Cast a Shadow. I do think a difference is that in some strange sense, it's not like a surprise. You know, a lot of literary thought and a lot of publishing industry thought is New York centric for different reasons, and you know that's all fine. And so I do think that to some extent, part of my job, whether I want it or not, is to represent what people are not thinking about in New York. I mean, even this whole thing that I've been saying now for years. You know, look, Sarah Broom put out the first international book by a New Orleans author, Black author in history, right? I mean, you're 301 years down the chain, pretty much from the beginning of the founding of the city. And like, well, who else was doing this other than Sarah? Well, that's you. We Cast a Shadow, the first novel. This is the first short story collection. And I even know from conversations, people in other places don't quite believe it. They're kind of like, well, how can you be from a majority Black city and have Sarah with the first, you know, big nonfiction book? And I'm like, I'm just telling you, it's true. And because of that, I think whereas We Cast a Shadow presents itself more as like a contemporary dystopian book that people can relate to, you know, a Paul Beatty's Sellout or The Invisible Man by Ellison. I think with a book like The Collection, people are kind of like, they won't figure it out until years after the fact. They'll look back and go, oh, he wasn't lying about that. This is like the first collection of like 19 main Black characters in one of these books. And I think I like that. I like the fact that, I mean, certainly for you and what you've done, and I think I try to do that as well, being ahead of the curve, that when they look back 5 or 10 years online, they go, oh, now I see what they were saying. I get that.
But isn't there something deeply aggravating and harrowing about the fact that we're in 2021 and in 2019, we're talking about 2 years ago, these supposed firsts happened? So what does it, I mean, you know, we've talked about this, I think, incessantly, right? At various bars throughout the city. But why is it that in a city like New Orleans, that is a Black city in essence and in spirit and in actuality, why is it that we don't have hundreds of writers? Is there a certain aspect of a city that makes writers? What's going on in New Orleans that there aren't hordes of Black writers the way there should be? Coming out of the city. What is that about, you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, perhaps We Cast a Shadow is a little bit more about that idea, because I hadn't asked the question before I wrote the book. But after the fact, I'm like, that exactly we've discussed before. How is it possible in a city that's been around since 1718, that in the vast majority of those years, it was majority African-American, majority Black? How is it in the city that's in the South, which is known for storytelling, in a city that produced, you know, Louis Armstrong, Lil Wayne, whoever you want to name, we're built to tell stories. And even more so than other major American cities, there is a sort of literary tradition, but a lot of that tradition is, you know, white outsiders. You know, your Tennessee Williams, your Truman Capotes, your Sherwood Andersons, you know, your Faulkners, yada, yada, yada. And I mean, I don't want to be like despairing about it, but when I think about what I mentioned earlier with illiteracy and poverty and straight up plantation mentality, it's as though you're picking off the people that would have created those works. There is some child born in 1950 who would have written like their version of like, you know, one of Alice Walker's books or one of your books. There's some child today that might write like their version of We Cast a Shadow. And yet, if they get locked up, if they can't get an income that creates stability, if they can't maintain their health, all these things are arrows that are pointing at the vicious problems of what New Orleans deals with, and particularly Black folks in New Orleans deal with. A New Orleans in which there are 20 or 100 major books coming out every single year is an alternate reality. It was like flying cars and teleportation. I want to see that, and I want to be a part of that, of encouraging that. But the fact of the matter is, I do get sad when I think about it. There should not just be one of me here. There should be, you know, 5 of me and 20 of you and 30 of so-and-sos. But it's not happening.
And I wonder if, because there aren't many Black writers from New Orleans, right? Fatima Sheikh and Mona Lisa Saloy, and I mean, so many others, right? I wonder if part of it is that the writers do exist, but we simply have not heard of them. We've not heard from them. Maybe that goes back to the New York publishing thing you were talking about earlier, right? That
Oh yeah.
because to be, I mean, how many writers in the history of writing come from positions of lack and want and poverty and despair, right? I mean, that seems to be a perfect recipe for creating writers. And we create musicians, right? We create visual artists by the droves, right? Chefs, chefs are artists. So interesting to think about. I mean, one of the things about that I was thinking a lot about reading this collection is, and in Before I Let Go, which just takes its time. I was thinking about time, the way you work in time, right? Because there's the flash fiction. There are structurally, you're doing interesting things throughout, right? And if structure is a kind of boat that is carrying along the goods, right? So we understand them, you're all over the map. What is it about this? What is it about you as a writer that that allows you to kind of embrace this sort of play and experimentation all in a single collection?
Oh, thank you for that so much. You know, I think it's connected to what you were just asking about, which I think is one of the best questions I've ever been asked. This idea of New Orleansness as being something that is not allowed to breathe. You know, Black writers not having these opportunities, whether it's Fatima Sheikh, or whether it's Maurice Carlos or Urban Weathersby, Ricky Laurentiis, people who are New Orleans adjacent, like Jericho Brown, who spent a lot of time in New Orleans. It's amazing how society just doesn't see them in some sense, in a lot of ways. And I think that when I was deciding on the structure and form of the various stories, I'm thinking about that. It's almost as if I was making the book in the form of a festival, like a music festival. You go to the festival, you got 5 or 10 stages. And if you go over here, you can see, so-and-so in this flash piece who's talking about being a boxer, but he's lying about it. You get like, a few minutes with him. And then you go over to the big stage and you get Galia, for 40 pages. And I'm thinking, and again, it's back to that original thought. I've never seen her as a lead character in a fiction book out of New Orleans. I want to give her as much space as possible. I don't want to get in her way. Like that whole fiction brain of mine is like, we got to cut this part and snip that together like that. It's like, no, she's like in a French film. She can just do what she wants to, as long as she wants to, so you can get acquainted with her as a person. And so, a lot of the flash pieces, I didn't realize this after I finished it, a lot of the flash pieces are actually cisgender Black men, or younger men. And a lot of the longer pieces are, Black women and non-binary people. So it was kind of like subconscious. I was like, all right, who have we not heard from yet? You get more time. That's automatic. And that was a structural choice of, short story versus novelette versus flash fiction piece.
And how much of that decision is happening at the outset, and how much is happening in the revision?
I think it's happening in the revision. Because some of the full-size stories started out as flash pieces, and I decided I want this person to have more time. And some of the flash pieces, I rewrote them as longer stories. And I was like, this is not quite working. I think this person we should get them quickly. So Mercury Forges is a good example of that. He has a pretty big story that he is in the middle of Hurricane Katrina. He's a prisoner who's escaped from prison. You could turn it into a tired 90-minute film if you want to. I'm like, no, he should get about 4 minutes of reading time, and that way I feel like I'm giving you the best of him. It's like the almond extract. You put a little bit in there.
Yeah.
The entire flavor.
It's the essence.
It's the essence of it. Yes.
And so, in terms of history and research, so another story that I loved so much was the one. So Cesara, is that how you pronounce it? Cesara Pittman.
Oh yes, Cesara Pittman. Yes.
Negress of God. So this is 1866, right? So you take us all the way back. And I won't ruin the story, but I was so intrigued by Cesara Pittman, Negress of God. I think we have to say the whole title,
Yes,
right?
thank you.
And I just wondered where she came from. And it made me think so much about how much you were sort of doing research or not, And it also made me think about whether your stories came to you as whispers or very loud or a
Mhm.
combination of both. That's about 4 questions, but I hope you can remember all of them.
I'll try. And thank you for bringing up Miss Pittman. And that name has resonances to, Miss Jane Pittman for reasons.
Yeah.
Uh, I think with most of my characters, they come to me first and foremost as a voice. I'll like start on a page and I'll just like start having a scenario play out in that very first page. And if it's not working, it feels flat. And if it is working, I'm kind of like, that voice is so specific. Who is that? Talk to me right now. I think with her in particular, I have been doing research for the 400 Souls book that was published a few years ago. And I was writing a story for that set in 1647 in Virginia about this black man trying to live his life in this sort of almost, this pre-American, almost pre-slavery era. And I kept thinking about, well, all right, but what's happening in New Orleans? And in fact, let's go 200 years after that to 1860. And I've been reading about the Mechanics Institute massacre, in which a bunch of activists, many of them black, a few of them white, were trying to make a constitution. And the lynch mob shows up and says, "No, we're gonna have that in New Orleans." That whole thing happens. And I kept thinking about how in many of my stories, the characters are in stasis. They're trying to fight for the humanity and for their rights and for their souls. And what I was calling the ending with Pippin, I'm thinking, nah, she's gonna win. She's gonna do her thing. And to me, in my mind, she is very much my attempt to reproduce my great 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 grandmother's generation. I know very little about that generation at all, but I can feel them somehow, and I just know that they were like they were about it, just to, like a better word. And so she is very very smart. In the early parts of the story, you realize that she can read the room, so to speak, and figure out, all right, this ain't gonna work. I'll make it work myself. And that's what I love. She is one of the most self-realized characters in the entire book, I think. Oh, you're on mute.
She really is, I think, a representation of this spirituality that I think exists in New Orleans that is very connected for me to ritual.
Mm.
And she's very plotting and she's very seeing, right? She's seeing very far off. And that's what makes her as a character so grounded and so brilliant. And she really, for me, represented the city in a way that I thought would be surprising for most people.
Mm.
And I love the ending because your endings are all, I mean, so interesting, right? They're sometimes, it seems like you're sort of mid-sentence and the story ends, right? What do you think about when you think about how a short story comes to an end?
Mm.
Does it change depending on the story you're telling, or do you have a kind of philosophy about beginnings and endings?
Oh, thank you for that. I feel like my favorite writers, and of course, you're top of the list, but people like my friend Gardner Cadigan and others,
Mhm.
they often will put forth this idea of not being afraid to have like an ellipsis, like offering the possibility that if you walk past the last page, anything is possible. And I think about I mentioned French cinema earlier. I think films like 400 Blows, when the very last scene of that film is this close up on this kid's face, and you're like, what's next? Well, you can imagine, possibly. And I think in New Orleans, there's something so intense about being from New Orleans, living in New Orleans. There are all these moments that for some people in other places, they'd be like the top moment in their entire life. I remember one time I went down to Oak Street, Maple Leaf Bar, 12:30 at night. And of course, it's packed with tourists, a few locals in there too. And I'm like in the front row. I think it was like Dirty Dozen, somebody was up there on the stage. I remember turning to the guy next to me. He just seemed so happy. And I'm thinking, this is like the best moment of his entire life. This tourist from Wisconsin. I'm like, we do this every day. This is our life every single day. And so I feel like with a lot of my endings, it's like, okay, this is a really important moment in this person's life, but I'm not even going to show you that next moment because there'll be a lot more moments like this in this person's life. It's just one example of that. I'm trying to give you the milieu and the flavor of it to take home with you in a little doggy bag.
I love that. And I know we have to wrap because people have questions, but I just want to ask you about in your influences. And so, for instance, in the story Token, I instantly, of course, I thought of Jamaica Kincaid's Girl, which is one of my favorite stories of hers ever. And then, of course, also in Pie Man, we understand the connection to Faulkner. What's your philosophy about when you make stories that are somehow adjacent to these other pieces that have been created? What's your philosophy about what you're doing in those
Mhm.
moments?
Yeah, I really feel like great work begets more great work. I feel like Jamaica Kincaid's Girl is one of the finest stories ever written because it's almost undefinable. You know, is it a story? Is it a poem? Is it a prose poem? Is it a hybrid? What are they calling it these days? I don't know. But I know for a fact that probably a dozen writers have tried their own version of that story. Like I know there's this dude in Tennessee, a white dude who puts like a, you know, this kid from the holla in one of these type of formats. And you mentioned earlier the container, the framing is really important. And with Token in my book, I was very much looking at Miss Kincaid's work and thinking, all right, well, how would this play out with somebody who's an adult in New Orleans, you know, 2010, 2015-ish, that sort of thing. I love to pay homage. I love to be in conversation with. I love to hold hands with. I just think that for me, it's great to be inspired and influenced by earlier work and then kind of think, well, if we're talking, you know, how's it going to sound? Or, you know, if I'm going to try and take it to the next level, how's that going to work? For me, We Cast a Shadow is just like my version of Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I'm just like taking that that supposedly good-hearted main character trying to live the American dream, seeing how he would survive in 2075. Um, in some ways, in the collection, I'm looking at writers from Z.Z. Packer, Danielle Evans, somebody like Willis Tower, and I'm thinking, well, how many different versions, how many different looks of this tone and this setting can you give somebody? So my philosophy is, I'm a heterogeneous writer. I want to have as many influences as possible, and I want to put out as many ideas as possible. You know, I don't want anybody to say, "Oh, there's Maurice, the same old idea." Never ever. I want to be new and fresh as much as possible and challenge myself and try and write things that I don't think I can actually write. See how it comes out.
I love that, Maurice. I listen, I could talk to you and this is how we roll for hours, but I'm so proud of you. Congratulations on book 2. Can't
Thank you
wait
so
for
much.
book 3. I'm trying to be like you, man, making a body of work. So I'm super proud of you. And thanks for the work and for the courage and for this conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, sis. And we're all looking forward to whatever you have planned next. We know it'll be amazing. So keep
Thank
going.
you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Wow. I have so many things I want to ask Maurice after that conversation. But before I get into anything, I might want to ask Maurice, I want you all to have a chance to ask Maurice questions. So, Maurice, why don't you come on and join me? And we will get rolling on these questions. First up, I believe we have one from Marion Moore, who is asking, were some or all of these written for the collection? Some seem so short, but were concise character studies.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And Megan, thank you so much for putting this together as usual. Uh, Thanks to everybody involved, Candace Hoover, who's running the tech in the background. Thanks to the NEA and the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development. And to everybody out there watching this, either right now, in the present, or at some point in the future. It's more, Marion Moore. It's always good to see you out there in the audience somewhere, even if it's virtual. That's a great question. The thing about it is that about half of the stories were written without me having any sense of wanting to put them together in a collection. So, for example, the oldest stories in the book are stories like Pie Man and Mercury Forges and Election and Despair, where I just explore the city as a writer and trying to put these voices on the page. Then there's some stories that I wrote very late in the process, after I'd already selected the majority of the stories, and I was kind of like, oh, this is a wrap, and I thought, no, there's something missing here. So stories like Rhinoceros and Before I Let Go are two good examples of stories that literally I was writing up to the deadline. I mean, I was working on those stories to the last possible moment. Um, a lot of the stories are very short. There's a total of 19. I think there'll be 6 or 7 flash pieces, so they're less than maybe 3 pages, give or take. And I find that form to be so compelling because often in life, we meet real people and we, either through conversation or hand knowledge, we find out that they have this interesting backstory or part of their life. And that's all you get. There's no follow-up questions. There's no following them around. And I just find it really compelling to take a character, give them 3, 4, 5 pages, and basically ask them, tell me what was the most important thing that happened to you in your entire life. And that's what flash stories are. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So I have a question. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting Maurice, he is not just an amazing author. Maurice is an amazing literary citizen. Every time One Book, One New Orleans asks him to do something, or Words of Music asks him to do something, he says yes, even though he's incredibly busy doing all the Maurice things he does. And that's not just our experience. Everyone I've ever talked to said, yeah, Maurice sat down with me, talked to me about my writing. We had such a great conversation. Like, you always make time. And so rather than ask you about your literary influences, I really want to ask you, what are the influences that taught you how to be this good literary citizen?
Wow, that's a great question, Megan. Thank you so much for that. Well, I mean, as somebody who is a former corporate lawyer, and I get to compare the experiences, no non-lawyers, you can do what you want to. I've noticed that writers are often very giving people, willing to take time to talk to you about your work, to get into deeper questions, more personal questions, more emotional questions. I mean, look, thanks to Sarah for being a part of this. I mean, Sarah's somebody I met over, a long time ago. And just in our discussions, I kept thinking, this is so wonderful. I couldn't have had this experience had she not taken the time. It's also parentage. My parents, my mother, Cassandra Ruffin, and my dad, Cecil Ruffin, he passed a few years ago. Both are people lovers. They love to discuss, talk, and smile and laugh those experiences. I think that for me, most personally, again, making this transition from being a lawyer to being an author, there have been so many people along the way who were just so kind to me, yourself included, people that I would have, never thought would just give me the time of day. And whether they were, people involved in editing or in publications or writers who had published, 10 books, just saying, sure, we can talk. And I remember, one example is John Bigonnet, teaches at Loyola, wonderful writer and professor. And I invited him to tea one morning. I think it was over on Bayou Road or something like that. And he talked like 3.5 hours about, how living as a writer. And I just never forgot that. I want to be that as much as I can in the community. And plus because, New Orleans is known for that. New Orleans is known, even beyond the South itself, as being one of the most hospitable places you can go as a person. So I want to embody all those things because it's important to me.
Thank you for that. We thank you for embodying them very well. I think we have another question from Marion Moore, and it's a good one. Have acquaintances told you that's me after reading your stories?
Oh boy. Well, look, anybody who's ever written anything, that thought in the back of their mind, people in their life respond to it. I'm not sure if anybody out there was paying attention to the kidney lady story. This to-do, or somebody writing a story that presented somebody in maybe not the best possible light, and that whole thing. And of course, many of us are drawn from our own backgrounds, our childhoods, our families, our friends. I've been pretty fortunate. I think that, generally speaking, for example, We Cast a Shadow is, depending on who you ask, it's a dystopian satire, it's a horror book, It's a literary novel, but it's set in the future. The characters sort of so most people, even though I can tell you honestly, there's probably about half of the cast where I'm thinking, based on Sony, but people don't seem to rate themselves very much. And then with the collection, the ones, I feel like with this book, I was kind of writing around the people closest to me. So there's a lot of young characters, and a lot of them in ways are based on people that I knew when I was a lot younger. So like in high school or even younger than that. And so, maybe they're kind of like, that could have been me. That was, this character is too young to be right now. There's characters from 1866, so I think that's been very fortunate. And also, I think that as a matter of practice, another writing mentor of mine, James Nolan, always said that if you're working with real characters, real people, polarize them as much as possible. So I may have a character who's like basically my own mother, but I'll make enough change kind of that can't be the same way. That's part of fun, sort of disguise and shield people. So I haven't gotten any heat off of that, but definitely my work is full of people from my real life, and if they figure it out, hopefully they'll appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. And while I, like Sarah, could go on for hours asking you things I've always wanted to know about your writing, I feel like at this point we would really love to hear you read some of your writing because, guys, the Maurice Ruffin experience is not complete until you've heard him read his work. So I'm going to get off this screen and let you read from The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody again for being involved in this experience. It's always a pleasure to read work. I always think that if you can read your own work well enough, then it's probably okay. That means you've done a good job of writing the work. And so, in honor of Sarah, I'm going to read one of the stories she mentioned as one of her favorites, which I rarely read in public. It's Cesara Pittman, or A Negress of God. And, this story is found inside the book on page 25. I'm going to read from some paper because it's better for my eyes. And, of course, as a New Orleans person, I always have music going when I get started to set the mood. So give me about 30 seconds to lay a musical foundation. All right. This is Cesara Pittman, presented to you in part by one of my favorite bookstores, Tubby and Coos, over on Carrollton. You can get this there if you would like to. Cesara Pittman, or A Negress of God. Do you, Miss Cesara Pittman, in the year of our Lord, 1866, aver to tell the truth, the whole truth, if nothing but the truth? Davidson, the attorney of the city of New Orleans, asked. It's hot outside and hot in the courtroom. Too hot for so many people to be on those benches. Close as piglets on a mama pig's. I touched the good book, my fingers touching on the gold edges. And that man, Buford, now I know his family name, sits at the table by his own lawyer, who wears those round glasses. And Buford's eyes are wide with hate. He's making all kind of faces at me, with those stitches down his cheek. Looks like Lucifer himself. But this book never sent me wrong. I placed my hand on my left breast. Yes, I do, I say. I promise on my very heart to tell the truth. Where were you on the evening of Wednesday, July 24th, 1866? Davidson rests his hands behind his back, making his belly stick out some. He's more than a couple feet away, but I smell tobacco and pipe tobacco every time he passed by. Well, as you say, mister, it was a Wednesday, and I was down on Good Children Street to buy baguettes. I make bread pudding for my husband and youngins on Saturdays. On Saturdays? Davidson's curled mustache shakes. Well, you gotta let that bread stale up good before you use it. Of course, Davidson laughs. Some of my folk in the gallery laugh too. It was long about sunset. I wasn't far from home, had a basket on my arm. Had left the butcher where I cut offal for other free Creoles like myself. Had just passed the barn where they keep the streetcar mules when footsteps made themselves known to me. Some girls had been handled wrong lately, and some of them had been shamefully desecrated. I didn't come down here for no devil work, I said, hoping to be heard. And a man came out of the shadow under the gaslight. This white man wore the clothing of a man of God, a white collar around his neck, a cross hanging underneath it. Just taking note of one of our father's children. In the light, he rubbed his hands like he was cold. But he had big shoulders and big, rough, grabbing hands, the kind of hands that plowed soil or worked on a cargo ship, not the kind of hands that prayed over the sick or baptized little ones. I held my hand out, palm up. You ain't no kind of priest. He smiled, all the yellow teeth in his mouth shining at me, looking like a mouthful of kernels. I don't take offense in the ignorance of your kind, he said. And I wondered if I was wrong about who he might be. But I thought on the book, and words came to my mouth. And I say it, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. What? He said. I rebuke you, I said. I knew enough to know that a priest should have got a twinkle in his eye when you said the scripture to him. The heathen's eyes stayed black. He might as well have been deaf. I dropped my basket and ran. And I was fast, but got tangled in my skirts. Fell on those cobblestones, hurt my wrists. He fell on top of me, clawing at my clothes, crisping my back, pulled at my chignon. And that made me madder than what I already had reason to be mad about. He shouldn't have done that. But the exacerbated madness reminded me of the poetry life. Life I kept in my hair. You see, I bought my manumission 5 years before the war. I was a free woman. But that didn't mean I had to prove it from time to time. When slave traders needled me, I had my papers in one hand and my shiny little poultry knife in the other hand. This man's sick breath was on my face. He was yanking my skirt. So I drug that knife in right under his left eye and drug it down to his lip. And I smelled the metal that's in blood. He yowled like a pitiful little dog. If I would have drug up instead of down, I could have popped his eyeball out like a Davidson raises his arm. Thank you, Miss Pittman. That will do enough. We do not wish to give the jury night terrors. I huffed. What about my terrors? I say, but he don't hear. Davidson points at Buford. Is that the man who accosted you? And Buford still making faces. He ugly as a pot of chitlins. His outsides match his insides. I like that I did that to him myself. Outside the courtroom window, the paddle boat toots. I watch a colored man throw bread at a duck. Some changes that happened since the war between the states. I was a slave most of my life, working the house on a plantation up near St. Francisville. I ain't a slave no more. But I know these men in the jury box. Few of them would have wished any of us found freedom. Mr. Barker, with the ruddy red cheeks, sells candles and other fine things. And that man with the mutton chops, he runs carriages. And that dandy on the end, a Virginian, almost a carpetbagger. Virginians, they used to send my people to New Orleans for punishment. They hoped that heat and terror work would kill us all. And then there's all the Martian men the so-called police killed at the convention not long after my meeting with Buford. The white trapped the good men inside the Mechanics Institute. When the men surrendered, dropping weapons, hands up, the so-called police murdered them anyway, right in the streets. Paul Dostie was holding a white flag when they shot him. These are the same men. I expect no kind of justice here. I'm just another darky, hardly worth throwing away the life of one of their own, guilty or not. So we're really only here on account of how loud Buford screamed when I cut him. Like a babe with the colic. And they saw my clothes, shredded like I've been clawed by a lion. And they saw Buford, too big around the shoulders and too rough around the hands to be a priest. The so-called police grabbed Buford on the spot. We made the papers. That's why we're here right now, because of all the attention. That man over there asked? Yes, miss. Davidson, the attorney of the city of New Orleans, says. Have you seen him before? That man over there who is ugly as sin? Some of my folk up in the galley laugh again. But the men in the juror box are beat-faced. Miss Pittman, I must insist. I squint. I never seen that man before in all my born life, I say. I swear. And people all around the room gasp. The judge bangs his gavel. Buford's lawyer with the round glasses stands. Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of the present matter. Later, it's dark out. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral over Jackson Square ring out. And this is how I know it's around midnight when Buford shows his face at the exit of the district jail. A so-called policeman shoves him out the street, and Buford dusts off his coat and starts towards the cathedral. But he won't make it. I doubt he was going to pray to the Lord anyhow. Don't matter none. My basket is full of baguettes and oranges for my youngins. And I have a knife, a long one too. I use it for gutting sow. And when I pull it out, it shakes like it's singing. Don't matter if Buford was going to pray. I'm his Lord tonight. Thank you.
Wow. Is there anything else to say but wow? Thank you so much for reading that one and for letting us hear it when you said you don't normally read it aloud. Thank you so much for your work and for being here. I'm so incredibly appreciative. And if that's the way we're kicking off these next 3 days, I can only anticipate how wonderful Words and Music 2021 is going to be. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you so much, Megan. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick break here at Words and Music. Go get yourself some lunch if you haven't eaten already today. And we will be back at 2:00 with Zachary Lazar and A.E. Rooks talking about This Life by Quantos Conquest. Thank you.